A very good afternoon to you all. A very good afternoon to you all. I am Professor M.R. Verma, Head Department of English, Gurukul Kangadi University, Haridwar.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon, sir. Uh, Professor Stefanos Stefanidis. I hope I am pronouncing your name correctly.
Almost. Stefanidis. Yes.
Stefanidis.
That's
Okay,
very good.
Thank you. Thank you for correcting me.
Yes.
I am thankful to the Faculty of Management and its Dean, Professor V.K. Singh, for making me a part of this interesting webinar, a webinar on literature and management. At first look, there doesn't seem to be much common between literature and management. Management as a field of study and literature as creative writing. Management as a discipline provides the students a foundation in organizational behavior and human resource management, and gives them an insight into the business world, marketing, and other related business activities. Literature, on the other hand, takes us into a world of creative imagination. Here, a writer conceives human characters and society that was there in the past, is around us at present, or maybe with us in future. He not only creates society as it is, but also thinks of it as it should be, as per the ideal norms as perceived by the writer. It is when we start looking at literature and management in a broader perspective that the similarity begins to appear. Both these disciplines teach how to manage. Literature teaches us how to manage life, and management teaches us how to manage the most prominent aspect of life, the economic activities, the pivot around which the life revolves. Literature shows us interaction of man with man, so does management, through its teaching of human resource management. Literature teaches us the joys of living. Management teaches us how to oil the machinery of life through its business activities and thus enhance the joys of living. So when we look at, I'm a student of literature, so I'm no authority on management. I can only talk about what literature does. If we look at literatures in all languages of the world, we find that its raw material is life. And since it deals with life, its emotions, its thoughts, its feelings, its complexities, its problems, its ups, its downs, happiness, misery. So it covers almost everything that human life consists of. And if we look at great literature around the world, we find that all the writers down the ages have been talking about the ideal way to live. That is the quintessence. This is not how they talk. This is not the moral lesson that they try to give. But this is what we derive from reading literature. Take the example of Shakespeare. If we talk of his tragedies, they do talk about the weaknesses of man and where these weaknesses lead to. So noblemen like Macbeth, King Lear, Hamlet, Othello, they all meet their doom because of some shortcomings in their life. Now, if we talk about the management of these problems, literature does show us the way to do so. Because ultimately, if we boil it down, we realize that this is what literature is teaching us. And happily, today we have got a scholar with us a scholar of eminence, Professor Stephanos Stephanides, who is going to talk about it. I shall be eagerly awaiting about it, sir. But let me say a few words about Professor Stephanos. Stephanos Stephanides is a poet, translator, and critic. Now, these three things, a poet is a creator, a translator is both an academician and a creator, and a critic is an academician. So a rare combination. A combination of all these three faculties do converge in Professor Stephanos. He is also an ethnographer and documentary filmmaker. Activities that take him out of a purely literary and academic world and put him in a broader perspective of things. Born in Cyprus, he was a professor of English and comparative literature in the University of Cyprus. His longer and shorter durations of living in the United Kingdom and Guyana and several other parts of the world, including India, he has given him an invaluable exposure to know cultures and people of different ethnicities. So he must have known through his long career how people manage their lives in different places, different countries. And his documentary films show his desire to know different cultures. As a poet, he is highly regarded. Several prizes awarded to him are a recognition of his achievements. That he was a member of the jury for one of the most prestigious awards of literature, Commonwealth Writers' Prize, twice, in 2000 and 2010, speaks volumes about his standing in the world of literature. This shows, sir, we are very happy to find you here, and I shall be eagerly awaiting to listen to you on the given area. So welcome, sir. And now I hand over the mic to the convener. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Professor Verma, sir. After the beautiful words of yours, I would like to request my fellow colleague to just give the brief introduction about our today's speaker, Professor Stephanos. So I request Mr. Pankaj Kumar, please give brief introduction about the speaker.
Dr. Pant, I think he is not seen here.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Because already the introduction isn't given by Professor Verma.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Thank you.
Yes. So as all of you may come to know about Professor Stephanos, and as Professor Verma told us about many things about literature, now I would request our speaker to enlighten us with his beautiful words about literature, management, and all. Thank you, sir.
Well, first of all, thank you so much for this warm welcome and these kind words. This invitation was a challenge to me, especially since I'm also not of management, I'm in literature. So when it was suggested to me by my friend and teacher, Gaurav Vokra, to speak about literature and management, I was a bit taken aback, but I thought, well, it's really crucial at this time in which we are reviewing our world, reviewing our disciplines, our borders, and reflecting on it. It's a time of crisis, and that's when we are especially critical. It was time to engage with what management may mean for literature and what literature may mean for management. And I think the words of Dr. Tyagi at the beginning were in fact straight to the point, and it really gave me something to bounce off. At first glance, it would seem, though, that literature is broad and creative, whereas management is something very specific and professional. But in effect, these are also constructs. And in terms of literature as an autonomous activity, as was implied in the introduction, literature is about everything, because it's about everyday life, it's about the way we live, it's about our world-making capacities. And we are all in some way or other literati. We are storytellers, we use language, and we organize our life and experience through telling each other stories. If you come home, you recollect what happened in the day, what's important is what not important. So the actual professionalization of literature, or making evocation of writing, is really taking that a bit further. And so in effect, it's an organizational activity. It's taking these stories and language and organizing it, which is what management does. And in that respect, I think it's good to reflect on language and how did language begin in the world, and what role language has played in our world-making capacity. When did human beings start speaking, or speaking the way we do? Other creatures also have languages. And initially, perhaps we only spoke in the present, very basic activities, telling each other how to manage. And it's interesting to reflect on the etymology of manage, which is from mano in Latin, which is hands, and agere, which is to act. So it's to act with hands, is to do things with hands, which is how we make things happen. And then we start using words in order to communicate this. We make tools with hands, and then language becomes an additional tool. And perhaps our community and social organization also developed once we began to be able to speak in the past, in the present, and in the future. That language is very much linked to temporality. And without temporality, there is not any story. When you're telling a story, you're saying what's happened, and you divide it up into time. And as you all know, as readers of literature, time is one of the basic motifs of writing, and time is linked to memory. So in effect, when we are writing something down, it's a process of memorializing. Of course, before we had literature as a written script, there was also the oral tradition, which would also memorialize by remembering. So the way we use memory through different process of mediation, whether it's oral or written, also affects the way that we construct the world. So I already, in talking about literature and language, I am having to speak about it in managerial terms, because in the process of organizing language and process of organization, it's also a process of exclusion, inclusion, selection, arrangement. And we do this both consciously and unconsciously. This is why writing, in effect, literature is always experimental, because the fact that there's a process of exclusion and inclusion, and whoever engages in the process as a reader or as a rewriter or as a translator is always redistributing, if you like, what's already what has been said. So there's always a process of distribution, redistribution, reorganization, rearrangement. And in the process, this has all to do with values, the qualities of life, how we reflect on it, and how we critically engage in this process of managing words and reorganizing the realities around us, as in the world around us, in which we are both participants and observers. And I think another aspect of language that I would like to emphasize right now, I think, is also the different levels of language and the different temporalities they have. And I think this is probably very obvious to Indians who most of the Indians I know are polyglots. I mean, I think you're probably bilingual, trilingual, tetralingual. You live in a multilingual space. And so there's all these different levels of language. So you're not only working within one language and redistributing all these different values that I have said and organizing them, but you're also working across and between different languages. And some linguists have defined these 4 levels as vernacular, referential, which could be the official or national language, international, cosmopolitan, and the language of beyond, if you like, the mythical and the spiritual or divine language. So all language, whether within one language or within several with which you are interacting, where you are located, these levels are always interacting, and they're also attached to different kinds of temporalities. So you could call the vernacular right here and now, what you speak in the everyday. You could refer to the referential or the national, whatever is the official, the standard, the national language. And then you have the languages of international communication that are everywhere. So you have a here, you have a there, you have an everywhere, and then you have a beyond, which is spiritual and mythical languages. And these interact both among languages, as I said, and also within one language. And in one way or the other, as a writer, you're in fact playing with all these different realities. And these different realities also never stand still. They're constantly in transformation. So what may be, and they go through different borders, divisions, and coming together. Like, for example, in the former Yugoslavia, Serbo-Croatian was the national language. And then when it broke up, they separated and made it into 2 different languages, the same way that Hindustani became Hindi and Urdu. So things join and separate and conjoin and become transformed. They become transformed for different reasons. One is largely, these are done for visions of where we belong, which are political visions. And these political visions are always in transformation. Growing up in the 20th century, I mean, the order was the nation state, which is a fairly new, in temporal terms, is something fairly new. So you had this rise of national literatures, and then all the post-colonial nation states modeled themselves, at least initially, on the nation states. So you have this notion of national literature. So I guess what I'm getting at is that even literature is also the aspiration of the artist is to be autonomous and free, but we find ourselves in constructed realities in the way that language is constructed around us and the different ways that we communicate and different levels of language, which are linked to our affective and or social or political or familiar connections, which interact with each other at different levels, and they occupy different spaces. Now, I've been speaking about time, but of course time, it's hard, you can't speak about time without speaking about space. And I think one of the critical turns in the last few decades has been the spatial turn in literature, whereas there was a big preoccupation with time. And in fact, and people, and many critics argue that in effect, language is all about the organization of time and space, and Proust, for example, remembrance of things past, is organizing things through space, and then through time, and then you have spatial, specifically spatial narratives like the Ramayana or the Odyssey that go across space, and then at the end of the narrative there's a kind of homecoming. So the space-time crossing has always been there, but there's been a specific spatial turn, if you like, in the 20th century, and especially post-Einstein, in which the whole temporal notions and how we see time has changed. And this has also affected, and without doubt, the way that we see literature and how we organize ourselves in, and how we imagine ourselves within literature and the literary world, and how we see genre or mode, etc. And of course, this is quite crucial to the present moment. This is my first webinar, and I was educated in the time when we did everything by handwriting, and then when I got to the PhD, it was on a hand typewriter. So how literature is mediated as well, and how the world is mediated, is always in transformation, and this comes about with different kinds of crises, like the one we're coming about now. There's times of more acute transformation, if you like, in which we begin to question all these categories and keep shifting the borders, even on a very personal level. Like, I'm in the Mediterranean, we always kiss our kith and kin, and now suddenly with social distancing, we're like kissing 2 meters away. So there's this renegotiation of how we interact with each other and how we interact with each other across the world. On the one hand, with social distancing, but on the other hand, I can see you there in Haridwar in a second. Although the issues, I think, have been there since ancient times. And I think at this point, and I'll come back to the management model again, I think I just want to talk about cosmopolitanism. And I think this is a word that has often been perhaps misappropriated, because it's often being conflated with global economic or economic globalization, and with the new managerialization of the world in the economic and business sense. But in effect, the origin of cosmopolitanism, and I'll go back to when the word was first used, is really in ancient Greek, is how we see ourselves in relation to the cosmos and to the polis or the polity. So, because the word has cosmos in it, the cosmic, and it has politan, which comes from politis, which is citizen, which is someone who lives in a polis, and a polis is that of organized men who are citizens doing things together. And the story goes, and here I also revert to oral tradition, but it's oral tradition that has gone into literature. There's different ways that discourses and stories open up and move on. Some, for example, Roland Barthes distinguishes between authors and writers, and he says authors may be authors without writing anything, but they open up a discourse and they are known for their discourse rather than their writing. So that's they author a discourse. So you may, Christ never wrote a word, but people refer to what is Christian. And so Socrates never wrote a word, but we know him through Plato. So this discourses are open. So the discourse of cosmopolitanism, according to storytellers, was when Alexander the Great went to visit a very bohemian and dissident philosopher called Diogenes the Cynic meaning the dog from its etymology, and who lived in a barrel and had become very famous. And he asked Alexander where he was from. Alexander asked him where he was from. And he says, I am a cosmopolitis, I'm a citizen of the cosmos. And he asked the emperor to step out of the sunlight because he was cutting out his direct communication with the sun. So, and he had a kind of renegade bohemian lifestyle. So if you like, this is one of aspects of what the function of art, philosophy, and literature in the humanities does, and is to really be on the margin and put into question what the symbolic power of the polis, of the polity is. And here he's challenging the emperor. And the founder of the Stoic school that followed very much from cosmopolitanism. And I'm saying all this to reclaim the political sharpness of cosmopolitanism against globalization, which, if you like, is a managerial model. And which was Zeno, the founder of the Stoics. Zeno was a merchant, therefore a manager of wealth, and he was shipwrecked off the coast of Athens. And from after the shipwreck, he began to read these cosmopolitan philosophers, and he developed his own relationship in which he developed his Stoic philosophy. Now, the fact that he had an accident, i.e. the shipwreck, I think is important in this story, because one of the things that we contemplate as writers and philosophers is the relationship between accidents and substance. And the whole point of cosmopolitanism is that the cosmos is much bigger and more powerful and unknowable than the polis. And the polis always has to be redefined, even if we cannot avoid it. We are social beings, we communicate, we only live through our communication. But it's also giving credence, if you like, to a greater power. And in the end, perhaps the greatest of these Stoic philosophers went up to the Emperor Marcus Aurelius. So if you like, he's managing an emperor, but he's also having lived through the plague in Rome, he's also reflecting, what is it as humans? How do we act? How are we? What is virtue in being human? How can we best respond to ourselves? For ourselves? So the question of ethics comes into it. So in effect, the ethical in Marcus Aurelius, the ethical comes together, if you like, in management and in empire. How do you manage this huge enterprise or business? And how can you do it ethically for the best of the human beings, and also recognizing the limitations of human beings, that we are susceptible to disease and death, and we can manage it better, not only in controlling it, but in terms of our response and our values. So with that background, I making it more directly coming to coming back to literature, I think Bakhtin, who many of you literary scholars will know, Mikhail Bakhtin, who developed the notion of the dialogic imagination, he also used the term chronotope, where time and space cross. And he argues that in the time-space compression, and when this is intense, this brings about a certain kind of discourse of transformation in literature. And he traces this through different crises in history, a crisis of transformation, going back to the satires of the cynical school, like The Golden Ass, which is a satiric fable in Latin, right up to Dostoevsky's The Idiot. And in a sense, what he's proposing is that in literature, we have to be idiots, like the idiot in Dostoevsky. Of course, the word idiot in its etymology did not have the negative connotations that it now does necessarily. Idiotic comes from idiotis, private, individual, as in idiosyncratic. So in your maneuvering across borders, and in your shifting between different registers and languages, you're opening up these possibilities of new discourses. In other words, you're taking the cosmos is both noble and unknoble. And it's also, to use a term by another theorist, Michel Serres, it's full of noise, in the same way that in the radio, when you listen to a radio, you might have static. You hear the message and you have static. There's other things going on that you cannot give meaning to. But if you had complete identity of meaning, there would be no movement, no temporality. Everything would be still. If you had only static, you'd be in chaos. So in effect, you are weighing up, shifting between meaning and noise to create new meaning. And the question, this new turn of cosmopolitanism, which I like to also, as a writer, I like to talk cosmopoetics, because poetics also has this making the cosmos or remaking it. And others like to use this term cosmopolitics. And although my tendency is to cosmopoetics, because politics is already in the polis, so the poetics is mediating the cosmos and the polis. In these crucial moments. And I know in India, I've been following the news. I came back a month ago, and there was the corona scare, then there was the tornadoes, you had a border tension with China, then you had the locusts. So this nature is overwhelming us, and it's overwhelming the polis, and the polis, or the politis, how to manage it and the ability to manage it, and how predictable and how much can we see, how can we open our vision. And this is where perhaps where literature is linked to opening the vision is also in the concept of theoria, which is more than theory. And I'll go back. In fact, the etymology of theoria, not the way we use theory, but in modern Greek, theoria is to do with vision, with thea, and the ability to see. So you, in the ancient world, you would go on to pilgrimages to receive a theoria. So it's the same etymology as in Sanskrit darshan, which has dras and see. So in effect, in crisis and transformations, we are exploring words, both in their viscerality, in their sensitivity, in their sensation, and not only in reason, in order to have a vision of the world, open up a vision of the world. And these visions, of course, never stay still. I mean, even in the construction of literature in my lifetime, when I was an undergraduate 50 years ago, it was a humanist, an anthropocentric approach, whereas literature was the secular religion of how to live a good life. Then this came into question, and then we had structuralism and post-structuralism and deconstruction, in which what is the politics underneath it? Is it, what does it really mean to be human? And then people started talking about the post-human and the post-truth and the post-colonial. So you're, in effect, reorganizing its possibilities, which never stop according to the challenges, like the original cosmopolitans did, according to the challenges and crises that have been thrown upon you. So when you're faced with pandemonium and chaos and an unknowable cosmos, then we are considering our living systems and ways of transforming life. And genre here is also very important in literature. We have, because genre, we have epics and dramas and tragedies and comedies, and we have different modes of conveying it. And these are constructions that are in fact shaping our perception. And in a dialogical genre, this is always, and this happens with satire, and this is what Bakhtin is taking, is we take these ways of shaping that become established, and the vision is poked at and turned inside down and reshuffled to examine the systems. And I think the notion there of system, and it's important to speak intersystemically, and if you and different ways of methodologies. All of these things have to do with methodologies, and the borders between disciplines is because we have different methodologies. So management and literature and economics can't be the same. But in effect, there is underneath, there's also ways, or both beyond and above, besides induction and deduction in our methodologies, we can talk about intersystemic transfer, which is what happens in translation. And since we were on to duction, like induction and deduction, let's talk about traduction, because in Latin and the Romance languages, instead of translatio, from where we use translation, which is to move across, they talk about traduction, traduction, because like induct and deduct is traduct, because you have a duct that channels water in certain directions. So the transduction, if you like, is making connectivity between different systems. And I think the way I prefer traduction to translation is because it brings in the sense of agency that is in traduction. Traduction, okay, in French, traduzione. What do you take across? and what do you not? This is where there is a choice, or sometimes there's no choice. Sometimes it might be imposed. There might be colonialism, imperialism, you impose something. But then the person who's being imposed then will resist and maybe throw something out, bring something back. So that it's not an active passive thing, even though it may be organized through different power systems. And all of these things, although I'm talking about critical and cultural theory in literature and the arts, or in cultural studies, because also literature has gone beyond cultural studies, but it's quite, it's also a managerial issue. There are human beings in groups and you're organizing yourselves. I mean, one thing that sticks to mind, I remember I was at one conference and my very good friend Susan Basnett, who's a famous translation scholar and chair of British comparative literature, she was trying to bring the conference to a summing up together, and people were straying here and there and quibbling and not going in, and she turned around and said to me quietly, she said, managing academics is like herding cats. So, which I thought was very appropriate. And I've been, in terms of, although management is not my discipline, inevitably, if you are in institutionalized context of literature, or an academic discipline of literature, your institution, you're brought into management. You have to chair, you have to make budgets, you're a dean. So there is also this struggle between the discipline and how you manage academics. So we're all managers in one way or the other. I hope I'm not speaking too long. Shall I wrap? How many more minutes do I have to sum up?
So go ahead, sir, go ahead. You have still 4 or 5 minutes.
I have 4 or 5 minutes. Okay, good. Thank you very much. So I think these are all, besides induction, deduction, and traduction, I guess before that I was also going to talk about abduction and how we abduct narratives, or what role abduction may play in the course of narratives. So, I mean, I think my key syllable here is duction, whether it's in or d or ab, and how this may give narrative a different kind of turns. And managers, even if it's a small enterprise, or if it's a country is your enterprise, or a big transnational, I mean, I think all of these issues which I've raised, which in fact deal with, if we want to talk about it in economic terms, it's the production, the circulation, and the reception of literature, okay? Which is also, and if you're within a narrative of an enterprise, or you're a leader or a follower, or both, because most of us at some time or the other are playing both. You're also part of a narrative with human beings that are unpredictable, and in a larger world that is also unpredictable. So you make choices, you take chances, and you take risks, and you have to negotiate these very quickly a lot of the time, especially in times like this, where the chance and element of unpredictability become increased. So what we're experiencing now is perhaps, I mean, it's an intensification of what we've probably always been experiencing, but it's just forcing us through this intense reflection of it. I think it's interesting, therefore, to think of the study of literature, historical anthropology, or literary anthropology as well, if you're the scholar observing it, and how we organize what we would call sciences or epistemes in different discourses in different disciplines. And the reason they're kept separate is mainly because of institutional vested interests. Somehow, often they feel that if you cross the border, you're diluting it, and you have to have so many publications and so many citations. It's become an industry that often lose sight of the pursuit of knowledge. So I think transdisciplinarity is obviously the way to go. I mean, I think also it's not good for literature to be simply self-enclosed either. It seems to be contrary to what its objective is, which is to engage with the world as a whole. And in effect, at the heart of all research, there are the eternal questions about what does it mean to be human in a group, in a society, in the cosmos, or as individuals, and how do these interact with each other. I was also pleased, I didn't know, although literature has been reaching out to these different areas, and you have specialized groups in literature and economics, literature and law, literature and medicine, and I was pleased to see that this is happening the other way around. And my colleague Alexia Banayodou, that spoke to you, I think it was about a month ago, also sent me various articles of what scholars of managers are doing and how they are looking at narratives and how these narratives, literary narratives, how they can inform the way we reflect on management as a profession. So there's one level, I've been talking about management generally, how we manage our lives, our home, and so forth. But it's interesting, for me, it's also interesting and positive that management has been able to open up these borders. Now, how successful it will be, I don't know. Because the university itself is in crisis and in economic crisis in these times, and the managerial model has become paramount. I mean, one of my complaints before I retired is that we spent much more time reporting what we were doing than actually being productive and creative itself, and always filling in form and ticking in columns. Nonetheless, I think there's two different things going on, and I feel that the progress towards transdisciplinarity is the way to go, and hopefully the managers in this new managerial model will become more sensitive and aware of this. I mean, I would like also to give a chance for questions, so maybe I see it's 1:18 on my computer. And maybe I should stop here and perhaps talk, and I hope you'll have some comments and questions, and a few minutes of dialogue. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor. You have beautifully connected the concept of time and space with the power of your words. I must say, life is itself a beautiful literature. The way you have explained the concept of cosmopolitan is so wonderful. So may I request Professor V.K. Singh, sir, to give vote of thanks to our speaker.
You can ask some questions from participants. We can take up some questions.
Okay. If participants, you have any query related to the session, please put your query on the chat box so that I can read it and ask with the professor.
Even they can unmute themselves and they can ask the question if they have.
Hello?
Hello? Yes, I can hear you.
Yeah,
Um,
it's not a question actually, sir. The only thing you very well explained about the idiots. Literature
okay.
also needs idiots.
Yeah.
So one more thing that I can see at your back, there is Hindi Varnamala.
Yes, yes. Ka, kha, ga, ga.
Yeah, so I just
Okay.
want to know what is the purpose and why it is there. It's so nice to see.
Okay. When I gave a talk in Bhubaneswar, this was gifted to me, and I have a lot of Indian things all around the house. India's been part of my life for several decades, and both shapes my thought and my spirit. So I have lots of, I engage with all kinds of arts of India at all levels, and people, of course, which are fundamental to this art. And I was in Bhubaneswar just when quarantine was imposed, and I had to rush back. So it's not to be locked in, yeah.
Thank you, sir.
You're welcome.
Thank you.
If any other participant have any query, they may ask to the speaker.
Sir, I have a question.
Please.
Sir, can literature contribute in the as you know, management is interdisciplinary. So, do you think literature can somehow contribute in subjects like organizational behavior and consumer behavior, which is there which is very much useful there in the organizations? And if literature can somehow insights and understandings developed by understanding different things in literature, if they can help human behavior, understanding of human behavior in the organization, so how can literature contribute in understanding such things?
Yeah. Well, I think it's definitely, I mean, of course, it depends how you approach it. And I don't want to say it's an all-time solution, because I mean, I was talking about my experience as a manager in academia, and I don't think the humanists did necessarily do a better job than the other managers. So maybe it's a tenuous thing to say, but in effect, I think the basic point I was saying is that literature is also about how we produce the world, how it circulates and its reception, and what is it that is received, and also not received at the moment, but also in the long term. So how do we see consumerism? And there's what kind of organization can there be with through the long duration and the immediate organization of an event, because often the long duration affects the event, and often we fix on the fact or the event instead of the long duration. So this is why I was talking about expanding our vision. I mean, how do we make what motivates us, and what pushes us forward to make choices? Why do we resist something, and why do we choose something else? Literature is also about deception. It explores self-deception. It tries to impose power sometimes, and it's often appropriated itself. So how do you take it back from where it's been appropriated? And each writer is seen differently at different times. So I think if you're in an enterprise, any kind of enterprise, I mean, these are issues. You know, what are the narratives you are living through as an organizer? I mean, you sit around the table, you have secret meetings, you have coffee, and you chat about different things behind the scenes. So there's different levels of discourses that are going on and interacting and feeding in and feeding out. Who's trying to undermine, who's trying to construct, why, what are the motives, what are the long-term goals, what are the short-term goals. So these are like values, not only, I think they're in enterprises, and in enterprises they're professionalized. And I think it's also the language of disciplines, because the in formal academic life, subjectivity, academic discourse rather, subjectivity has been extracted and taken out, even in the humanities, because at least a generation ago, we were trained to talk in a scientific language that takes out its subjectivity, because the science type subjects were more powerful. But then every discipline has its own narrative, and I think the element of subjectivity and recognizing, in other words, there's not a world out there and us here. We're both observing, and that's what academic discourse wants us to observe and pretend we're not there. But we're also participating. And I think this is what literature can teach us, how to participate more wholly within ourselves. What gives us joy and what gives us feeling. It's not only what gives us money. And one of the debates I'm seeing every day now here is, well, are we going to let more tourists in because we need the money? Or are we going to keep the space open so we can be safe? So these are kind of both ethical and economic decisions. And this is a current one. But this is what we find, I think, in throughout our lives, in the way what do we let in, what do we let out, why? Okay, it's a kind of labyrinth. Another plot construction is that narratives are all labyrinthine, and you come to various junctures and disjunctures, and do you go that way, do you go the other way? And in the end, it's all a process, because, I mean, finally, as the Stoics would say, we're all mortals. So you're in this labyrinth, you go in and you're trying to find an exit. But then when you're out, you might come back in again. And I mean, it's, I don't know, I hope that makes sense. But in other words, you are, perhaps another way of looking at it is that narrative is an allegory of retrieval of and salvage. In other words, when you're creating stories, you're retrieving something, and you retrieve something for something to continue into the future. So there's a sense of loss and retrieval, and this is both an economic as well as a human activity. I mean, we write because there's something lost and we want to retrieve it. And this is what is going on in the financial and economic world right now, where we're losing money. How are we going to retrieve it? So these narratives interlace. So I think the process is really to be able to reflect on the how these look at the interlacing, if you like, the transfusion, the transdisciplinarity. I mean, we have to think along those terms. So it's not just selling as much as possible, getting the consumer to get something as much as possible. I hope that makes sense. I'm sorry if I...
Yeah. Yes, sir, definitely. And thank you so much for giving such a deeper insight into all these things. And sir, one more question I have. Sir, how can different aspects given in the literature, not only English literature, but other literatures as well, can help in developing some counseling or some motivational programs for people, especially in adverse times which is needed during current times of COVID.
Yeah.
People, yeah.
Well, of course, literature has always had that humanistic dimension. And I'm glad you said not English literature or literature, because the idea of English literature is really also cosmopolitan. Even Shakespeare, who is appropriated as the English legacy, he himself did not write, except for the Merry Wives of Windsor, none of his plays are set in his own time, which they're set in other spaces and other times, which means he's critiquing what it is to be English in Elizabethan times. So I'm glad he is beyond English, even Shakespeare. So this is why I take a world literature, cosmopolitan and transcultural approach to it. Because the national literatures are just constructs. So yes, so I think it's looking for the humanistic value. There is humanistic value in literature, which is essentially what you're asking.
Actually, yes, sir. Yes, this humanistic aspect which is covered in literature is must. And if we want to refine cultural attitudes of people, and so that they can face adverse situations such as COVID or any situation, any adverse situation which can arise in normal functioning of organizations as well. So thank you so much for answering these. Yeah.
Thank you, Professor. You have put the best words in the best order. Now I request Professor V.K. Singh Sir, Head and Dean, Department of Management Studies, to give vote of thanks to our speakers and our listeners. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Dr. Divya. At the outset, before I convey my extension and warm thanks to Stephanos Stephanides, there are the two people who acted as a bridge between the Stephanos and Professor Verma and Professor V.K. Singh, and these two people were, which I cannot forget them, as Mr. Pankaj from English department and my would-be doctor. Both are would-be doctors, Divya Pant. They both have acted as a bridge. So thank you, first of all, for comparing a very beautifully you have done. And
thank you.
As far as Stephanos is concerned, you see, this is the first time which happens. How it clicked the idea to my mind was, and I'm thankful to Professor Verma, Professor Shravan, and Professor Ambuj, who are the three pillars of English department. And I just simply conveyed my idea that why not we can have a common session, and to which they have agreed. So you see, Stephanos started his pitch by looking to the process of memorialize, which he converted into the process of mediation, and further he talked about exclusion and selections, and very nicely he put his words through distribution, redistribution, and reorganizations. Very well managed, how the literatures and management can coincide with each other, and very beautifully he talked about managing, reorganizing the realities to a different level of languages, and then further you talked about constantly a transformation of the situations. You also had some beautiful situations and pens from post-colonial national states, and very beautifully also talked about the aspirations of artistic and constructive realities, which is doing well to the literature. And above all, I was very penned to listen that when you put example of post-Einstein temporal motion, how things really move and get to link to a story of Alexander the Great, and how the cosmopolite which linked to the citizen of Cosmos. And then you further give an indication of Xenos, who is a manager of wealth, and he normally put to a cosmopolitan philosophy. Sir has also put dimensionally to the relationship between the relations and substance, how the relations and substance acted together to have a very brief structuring of the realities which we look upon. Then with one more example of Marcus Aurelius, to which he talked about, an emperor of Rome, and he looked upon the virtue of being human, to how he moved on to ethics in management, which we look as a very broad way of the depthness of management. And further, you tried to get on to how managers had a huge organizations and how things can be managed in a very beautiful way. Then further, you talked about the chronotop, which looks to the time and space cross with each other. And very beautifully, you said that, the word idiot, which normally connotes with the negative connotations, but actually it is not supposed to be, and how beautifully you explained with the structuralism and post-structuralism. And then the very best part, which I really loved, sir, in fact, was very close to my heart, was the way you played with the 4 words: induction, deduction, then transduction, and ultimately abduction. So all this, which has ended up with the duction word. And believe me, Professor Stefanoid, this word also has a lot of meaning in a management, because in a marketing research or in research methodology, this induction and deduction process is very common. And that is what you really come up with your entire discourse. I'm really thankful to every people on the board, which I could see is Alexia, who happens to be our resource person, a very known faculty of University of Cyprus, and then Professor Arora is Professor Dr. Kishan Kumar, Dr. Neha, then Dr. Sanidhya, Sandhya, Dr. Vagish, then one more I could see is Zaho. Zaho is also here, and then Magios is also here on the board. I can see it, and then Mukesh Verma Sahab, who happens to be the main source of inspiration. Then Augie and Sangeeta Chauhanji, and Safali Joshi, Shailja Handa, then Tripti Joshi, and many more. So I cannot forget to thank the real person who is behind this show, none other than my own student, Gaurav Vora, who is working with the High Commission of Cyprus. And, this really gives a meaning to us that why not management can contribute to all the aspects of the field. And last but not least, there is a very beautiful quote, and the quote says, "A good book is an event in my life," which was being said by Stendhal. And before I convey my extension, thank you, Professor M.R. Verma, for blessing this soft board. And thank you, Stefanois. You really happened to give a very beautiful pinned-up structuring of how management and literature can really come on a particular stage, and the people from management and the people from literature, which normally feel that management cannot be parallel to literature and literature cannot be management parallel to literature. And in a very brief way, you have given a very pinpointed structure stating that management and literature both can be same part of a railway track. Thank you, everyone on the board. Thank you, Stefanoid. Thank you, Professor Verma. Thank you, Divya. Thank you, Pankaj. And every faculty members of my department, Professor Surekha Rana, Professor Patiraj, Professor Pankaj Madan, and some faculty from English department. They really acted as a bridge. Thank you once again to everyone. Have a nice day.
Thank you, Professor Singh.
Thank you, sir. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir. Thank you. Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much. It was a delight. And thanks to all who have enabled, who are actors, enablers, agents, listeners, and wonderful commentaries. Of course, are very important. And I hope we can meet without social distance one day soon.
Thank you, sir. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Sure. Thank you. Thank you.